One of the best things that we can give our children for their safety, security and happiness is to provide them with boundaries, limits that they know that they are free to live within. Now, they're going to test those boundaries. After all, they are our children and they're human. But those boundaries, though they may seem restrictive, tell the child a whole lot about their parents, about their loving concern for their safety and happiness and well-being. Now, it's like that with God too. He's our Father and we're His children. And He's given us boundaries because He loves us, boundaries for our safety and well-being. And it's true, like so many of our children, we often test those boundaries too. They may not seem fair to us, and they may seem to restrict our freedom, but they're given by a God who loves us supremely. God is love, therefore He provides for our safety and protection. So let's have a closer look at the boundaries that our Heavenly Father has given to us. James, why is it necessary that we have laws in our society?
Well, if you think about it, laws are designed to keep our social fabric together. Think about countries where those laws have broken down, countries like Zimbabwe, Somalia, and in North Korea, where one person's rule becomes the law of the whole nation, rather than having a set of neutral laws that governs everyone. In each case, the breakdown of law has resulted in a complete breakdown in the social fabric, and indeed famine in all three countries, and other severe economic consequences. So without a set of reasonable laws that apply to everyone, we have a breakdown of society.
Chaos.
And I think the same's true for God's law, James, too, in the sense of the Ten Commandments. You know, we look at that law as a law of relationships. You know, the first four define our relationship with God. The remaining six, you know, our love for one another, our relationship with one another. Let me share a text with you from 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. It says this, "Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, for God is love." And I think we really do see that reflection in the Ten Commandments. It's a set of loving boundaries for relationships to ensure that those relationships are happy and healthy. You know, I have 3 kids. You know, they're quite young at the moment, but there will come a day where I'll go into a bit more depth, explaining why we have those boundaries in our family and in society. Like you take the commandment on, say, adultery. You know, I want my kids protected from, you know, STDs and them having to make choices about the pregnancy that, you know, my daughter may have one day, or the relationship my boys are going to have with their wives, you know, to make sure that they have loving relationships, healthy relationships, physically, emotionally and sexually. You know, God wants that for us too, you know. Don't steal, you know. You don't like things being stolen from you, don't steal from somebody else. Don't rip someone off when they're trying to make an income when they own a shop. You know, all of that kind of stuff.
James, what did Jesus, I mean, after all, He's the authority, isn't He? He's our real authority. What did He say about the law?
Yeah, I was smiling when Danielle was talking. I was thinking about love is all you know, the song, love is all you need, and so on and so forth. I grew up in the era pretty well of free love, and the people in Jesus' time, Jesus spoke about love so much that the people of His time, they thought He was talking about free love. There's no law, there's no boundaries. All that matters is you love each other. And when you think about it, it sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But what Jesus actually said was, don't think, this is in Matthew chapter 5 and verse number 17. Matthew 5 verse 17. Don't think, Jesus says, that I've come to destroy the law or the prophets. I didn't come to destroy it, but to fulfill it. Now, in the era of free love, I'm a bit of an older bloke now, but when I was younger, I knew about God's law. And I knew that God's law was all about love as well. And I was, you know, alive in the time of free love, just like today, really. Not much has changed. And I'd watch my mates, man, they were so popular with girls. They could just pick them up and score, and women were objects. And I've got to tell you, now I have a different view, Danielle, but back then, picking up and scoring seemed like a whole lot of fun. And in my brain, I was actually upset that I was a Christian. I was upset that I knew God's law. It was this big conscience thing that clanged in my mind. it actually protected me from a lot. And it was only about a decade later, looking back on what God's law and its knowledge, my knowledge of it had protected me from, that I ended up being really happy. And I just couldn't share enough with people, anywhere and everywhere, the wonderful benefit of following God's law. It feels restrictive, but Jesus said the law is about love.
I think you make a very good point, and that is, you grew up in an era where we were told that love meant one thing.
Yeah, no law,
no
freedom.
Law. But God actually gives us a view of love that's very different. And that's why understanding what God's law is important to understanding what love is, because love can mean 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. God gives us what it means in a very succinct manner.
Explain that to us, James.
Well, sure. I mean, if we go through the Ten Commandments, I'm a lawyer. I studied law, and there are thousands of laws out there that govern a society. God gives us a law that's only 10 commandments long, incredibly succinct and incredibly powerful. The first law that he gives us is, I'm the one God, don't have other gods before me. Secondly, don't make idols, which is related to the first. Third, don't take my name, don't take God's name casually. And because God is holy, he's serious, he created us all. And fourthly, remember the Sabbath day as a weekly memorial of God's wonderful and amazing creative power, where we came from and why we're here. So those are the first 4 commandments. The latter half of the commandments deal with our relationship with other people. And they start off with honor our parents, don't kill each other, don't murder. These are very basic things. How do you love someone if you're killing them? Don't commit adultery. That is, don't go off with somebody else's spouse, and don't cheat on your own. Be faithful. And you can think of how much unhappiness has come from people breaking that. Don't steal. Don't take other people's stuff. Don't lie about your neighbor or other people. And finally, don't spend your time coveting. Don't focus on what other people have. You're going to be dissatisfied. You're going to be unhappy. Be satisfied with what God's given you.
James, would you think that in the Ten Commandments really is the summary of all that's contained in the Bible?
Well, as you know, Christ went even further than that. He summarized the law and the prophets as love God with all your heart and soul and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. First 4, love God. Last 6, love each other.
The trouble is with some people that I have met over the years, they say, well, you don't have to worry about the Ten Commandments any longer. As long as you love God and you love your fellow man, that's all you have to do.
But how can you love your fellow man if you're, let's go through them, killing, stealing their spouses, lying about them? You know, it's sort of a disconnect in thinking. All these things lay out what love means in a very practical, tangible, but succinct manner. You get away from that, and where's the love?
Yeah, and thinking how much better a world it would be today, because you're a lawyer from the States, how much better it would be in the world today if the global financial crisis hadn't occurred. And how did it happen?
Well, yeah, look, I have friends who worked on Wall Street, and a number of them were laid off after the financial crisis. But the bottom line, the crisis came because people were dishonest. People working on Wall Street understood what they were doing was lying about the value of the underlying real estate, both to the people who were buying it and also to the individuals who eventually bought
stealing.
And there was, and by
You had
committing
lying and
dishonesty,
stealing. If there was no lying and stealing, we wouldn't have a financial crisis. It's a no-brainer.
Which you're absolutely right. And of course, the trillions of dollars of value that fell off people's property and their retirements and all the chaos that's ensued from that.
Yeah. Danielle, tell us, where did the Ten Commandments come from?
Where did the Ten Commandments come from? You know, I think that's a really awesome question, because they came directly from God. Directly from the finger of God. It's the only part of the Bible that he directly wrote himself. And so we actually find that written in Deuteronomy chapter 9 in verse 10. Just to back up that statement, because it's a huge one. Then the Lord delivered me 2 tablets of stone, and this is Moses obviously, written with the finger of God, and on them were all the words that the Lord had spoken to you on the mountain from the midst of the fire in the day of assembly.
You know, I've often thought about that. That's a very, very good point, Danielle, about the fact that the only part of the Bible that God actually wrote I mean, he inspired all the Bible
Yeah, obviously.
through prophets and so forth. But the only part of the Bible that God actually wrote himself were the Ten Commandments. Yeah. And he didn't even write them just once. You know, when Moses broke them, he actually wrote them the second time. I've often thought of, well, Moses, you come up and you know them now. You write them down. But no. He wrote them down the second time. To my mind, that shows they must be important.
Well, the other thing was that they were written in stone.
Right.
You know, they're solidified. They're to stand the test of time. The other thing with it is that I think the reason that God needed to write that himself and that no one else could do that on his behalf is because it's the very document that is guiding humanity and is the very revealing of the character of himself, which is, as we read before, God is love.
James, do you sense that you can judge a nation by its laws?
I think you can definitely judge a nation by its laws and how it applies those laws, because obviously you can have a disconnect there. But if you look at nations that strive to be just, fair, and to treat everyone under the same rubric of the law, whether he's or she's the prime minister or the president, whoever it is, they all are covered by the same laws. That says something very deep about that society. When you get a society, on the other hand, where the president or the ruler, whatever the description is above the law, or an elite is above the law, you get a whole different dynamic in society, and that's when we have the breakdown of society that typically leads to a ruinous future.
James Toogood, what do you think about the law of God? How does that reveal his character?
Yes, look, the law of God reveals the character of God so clearly. A lot of folks are wondering, where is the law of God actually found? It's in Exodus chapter 20, and you can have a read for the 10 laws yourself at some point. We've mentioned them briefly and summarised them. But the law of God shows that God's love, just shows to me, God's love over and over again. I'll show you how. God wrote it in stone with his finger, and to me that sounds pretty rigid. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be judged and condemned by a law that's inscribed in stone. All you could think about it is the most wonderful, loving things that men do for their wives or girlfriends or whatever is when they buy them an engagement ring. And you get buy this beautiful sapphire, that was Prince William and Katie, or you buy a beautiful diamond. And so rigid doesn't have to mean unloving. Rigid can actually be a symbol of the greatest love. God wanted us to understand that his love never changes. God himself won't steal from us. God himself won't take away our life and its enjoyment. God himself never breaks his relationship with us. He doesn't commit adultery against us. No matter what we're like, he's committed to us. God himself doesn't lust after what we have. He wants to promote our happiness. God himself doesn't use our names in vain. He doesn't say, oh yeah, Jeff, you're worth nothing, and just use your name. However, God respects you as an individual. God himself observes his law, and God's character is revealed in that law. It's the most amazing thing, which is why in James chapter 5, James calls this law the law of liberty. It's the most amazing thing to me when I think about it. God's law that we keep, he himself observes. If there's any huge underlying theme, and we've been looking at this, where an epic theme, bigger than anything humans can contemplate, if there's ever a huge underlying theme, if there's something that the universe rages over, it would have to be law. Is law fair? Is law just? Is law good? And I look at a law and I think about stone. It seems and feels rigid to me sometimes, but when I stop and think, God himself has promoted a set of neutral principles that he himself abides by.
You know what else I think, just in addition to that, is the fact that the law is a law of love, and therefore it is also a law of selflessness. You know what I mean? It's about what am I going to give of myself for other people.
And if you look at it, how God applied that, he didn't hold back anything.
Not even his son.
Not even his son.
We don't often associate, do we, law and liberty. We sort of see them as opposite ends of the spectrum. But here, what James was reading to us in the book of James...
That's not chapter 5 at all, it's James chapter 2, verse 12. James 2, verse 12, it says, a law of...
liberty.
Yes.
I guess when you think about that, I mean, marriage or a relationship with someone is a pretty restrictive thing, isn't it? I mean, I decide to get married. That means now that I can't go flirting out with this girl and taking this other girl out. It's the most restrictive thing. Our relationships, they are bound together, but we don't think of that. When we really love one another, we don't think of that as being restrictive. We think it is liberty. I don't want to be around with everybody else.
If you take a business illustration, if you want to start a business where you're writing software, do you feel that it's a restriction on your ability, your liberty to do that, that there are laws that protect the intellectual property that you create? Of course not. It's necessary. No one's going to create intellectual property if they can't have it protected. The law that protects you gives you the liberty to go and do that venture. Similarly, in your life, the law that protects you or guides you against adultery and other things protects your marriage and gives you the liberty to enter into a marriage, because you can try a marriage, and I've been married 20 years, and I can tell you my wife's a wonderful person and very patient, but I'll tell you one thing, if I broke this law, she wouldn't be around long. I wouldn't have the liberty of a marriage. Yeah. And I think that's the illustration. Yes, there are boundaries, but it gives you the liberty to enter into a relationship and have that relationship stable.
1 John 3:4, it points out sin and it shows us when we do wrong. And instead of being negative, it's positive.
I think what some people find confusing is that Christians believe that we're saved by the grace of God through faith. And they sometimes and some Christians get confused by that and then ask, but so then there isn't a role for the law within our Christian experience. But I think Paul, who wrote as much about grace and faith as anyone, makes it very, very clear in Romans chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. He says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? It's a good question. So we're saved by grace, we have faith. Should we just continue breaking the law, sinning? And this is what Paul says, certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? And I think that's the key.
That is a big issue today. Everywhere I go, and I'm sure you found it too, and many of our viewers would also find this true, that we are often quoted, or misquoted, should I say, the verse over here in Romans chapter 6. And, Paul was saying here, you're not under the law. This is chapter 6 and verse 14. For you are not under law, but under grace. James Toogood. How do you reconcile that with what James Standish has been saying and what we're talking about here, the relationship of liberty and law? Not under the law, but we're under grace.
Well, the only way I know of answering this in a truthful way is to be completely honest. And the honest truth is, I know about God's law. I broke it. I broke it when I was younger. Yes, I might have kept myself somewhat good in some aspects of the law, but I break it continually in other ways. I still do so today. We all struggle with breaking God's law. We all face this huge thought, wow, God has a standard. We fall short. God forgives me because I've asked him through Jesus. I've said, God, would you forgive me? Because I broke your law. But the difference between law and grace to me is this. It's one thing to acknowledge that I'm sinful, that I've broken God's law, I need his forgiveness every day. It's one thing to say, I need forgiveness for what I've done wrong. It's a complete other thing to say, who gives a stuff about the law? God forgives me, let's not talk about law, let's forget about law, let's live in a society that's free and easy and let's not worry about it at all. When the Holy Bible says, I'm not under the law, I'm under grace, I'm forgiven by Jesus Christ because of God's love for breaking his law. And I think the very least I could do is to honour it. I may not be, I'm so far from perfect, it's just hilarious and I feel very fragile about it sometimes. But to think that the God of the universe forgives me, gives me his grace. Man, suppose there's a man who decides to be unfaithful to his wife and his wife forgives him. Does he then go and be unfaithful the next day? What would you do? You'd get out the shotgun. Well, no, you wouldn't, Danielle. You're a loving person. But I'm talking about general principle.
The true repentance is the fact that he would be so grieved that he had done something destructive to that relationship and hurt his wife, that he would refrain from doing that again.
Well, let's hope that more blokes are like that.
I think, Jeff, that it's important too to make the connection that we aren't saved by keeping the law.
Right.
Absolutely.
Good.
And that's very important to keep.
Yes, it is.
There's nothing that a human being can do to reconcile their relationship with God. Only by the grace of God do we have access to salvation.
Right.
Once we have that access, that relationship, that love, that's when our hearts are filled with thankfulness, and out of an act of trust, faith in God, having faith that His way is the best way, in love, respecting, and wanting to keep that relationship strong, that's where the desire to follow the law comes.
So that's where love fits in with the law.
Absolutely.
It's the motive
Well,
for obedience.
And it's Matthew 5:18. Jesus said, heaven and earth will never pass away. Heaven and earth may pass away, but my law will never pass away. The law remains, the law stays, and just because we humans break the law and we fall far short of it, doesn't mean we should machine gun the law. It's not the law's problem. Instead, Jesus said He'd never let it pass away because it's a law of love. If the law was to pass, we'd start killing and murdering and thieving, and where would the love be then?
You know, I've often thought if I was caught speeding, and I guess we've all been through that, you know, time to time, and then I go to court and the judge lets me off, James, if I was to get into my car and then break the law again, speed, and then I see the officer pull me over and say, now listen, officer, I want you to understand that I went down to the court extended its grace to me, and I'm no longer worrying about your law. I mean, if we reason such foolish reasoning like that, no one would say that in real life, and yet that's the way some people argue with God's law. Because we're saved by grace, it means we no longer have to keep God's law. But that verse is not saying that. That verse is saying that because we're saved by grace, we are no longer under the condemnation of the law. That's what it's saying.
But I would go even one step further. If we are saved by Christ, by God's love, why would we want to keep on breaking His law?
Absolutely.
And I think that's one of the big problems, is that many of us, and maybe all of us, go through this situation where we want that relationship with God, and we want that we want the benefits, if you like, but we haven't fully trusted in God. We don't really think that what God's telling us is the right way to live. We think we might know better. We might know a better way to have more fun. We might know a better way to get more thrills, or whatever it is. But when we give our entire hearts to God, our entire lives, our hearts, our souls, our minds, that's when keeping the law is a natural outpouring of that, rather than a sort of a burden on top of a rebellious heart. God breaks down our hearts, gives us a new heart, and that's when following His law becomes part of our desire.
Yeah, it becomes the opposite. Like, you're not going to go and steal your best friend's car. Do you know what I mean?
That's right.
You love them. You would never want to hurt them or damage the relationship in that way. It's so true, James, so true.
What I love most about God's law, is that God keeps His law Himself. We've spoken about this before, but that means He's committed to a relationship with me because I said, God, forgive me, and thanks for being my friend. God's committed to a relationship with me. When I break His law, He forgives me, but He keeps His law, which says, thou shalt not commit adultery against your friend James. And He remains committed to me, even though I'm so flawed and faulty. God keeps His commitment, and that's why St. Paul can go and write, by grace you're saved through faith, not of the law, because on my side I've broken the law, but He keeps His law and He forgives, and He's remained committed to me. The only reason I think God still loves me sometimes, He's got a law. It's in His interest.
One of the great discoveries that I made when I began to study the Bible was this, that when I come to Jesus and I accept Him and accept His grace, He gives me power and strength to be able to do all that God wants me to do. Because I meet some people say, you can't keep the commandments. That's only a half-truth. A person in their own strength can't keep the commandments, but when we have the power of Jesus in our life and His grace fills our life, then, as Paul said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And I think that's the exciting part of being a Christian, isn't it? It's not just a matter of some intellectual knowledge up here. It's something that really works down here in our life from day to day.
And if hearts were ruled by Christian principles in Wall Street, there'd be less stealing and less lying, more love, more superannuation. And if people were to accept Christian principles inside, then we'd be loving our neighbours more, we'd be talking fewer lies about them, we'd be coveting less and promoting love. It's just a wonderful thing what Jesus can do inside us.
As parents, we wouldn't be worried about the safety of our kids. We wouldn't be locking our houses up. We wouldn't be securing our stuff.
Heaven.
What a wonderful society. So we have noticed today that in the story of God's law, that this is really the heart of the epic story that has been going on between good and evil, that Jesus, God made a law and Satan said nobody can keep it. But Jesus has shown us that when the love of Christ comes into our hearts, it becomes a pleasure to do what God wants us to do. And his character is on display before the universe because the Ten Commandments and his law represents the wonderful character of Jesus. God has given us 10 simple rules. And if every person lived by those, what a wonderful society it would be. No stealing, no adultery, no coveting, no sin at all. And Jesus came to show us on this earth how that sort of life can be lived. And through his power today, we can still live it. I have a wonderful verse that I would just like to leave today over here in John, the 14th chapter, and verse 15, where Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." And in his appeal today, he holds out his nail-scarred hands and says to every viewer, to me, Jeff, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. And I hope that the response in all of our hearts today is to want to follow Jesus and to do what he wants us to do as he reveals it to us. Let us bow our heads in prayer. Our Father in heaven, I just want to thank you again today for your love. I want to thank you for the fact that you have given to us these commandments, not as a means of our salvation, but because we want to keep them because we love you and as a response to what you have done for us. We realise, Lord, that they are like the fence around those lions, that they are there to protect us and to keep us from going down the wrong path. And so bless every viewer today and bless us as we continue to study your word, I pray for Christ's sake. Amen.